Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Colin Mahan. I'm a program manager at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. For those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit dedicated to enabling entrepreneurs from all over the world to realize their maximum potentials and grow. Speaking of all over the world, let us know where you're dialing in from. We've got San Francisco, so we're on Pacific with us, but if you'd let us know, it would be great to understand where you're at and where you're coming from. As you may have seen in the chat, the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center, along with our partner Mentor Cloud, launched a free mentor matching platform for entrepreneurs called Mentor Makers. You can create your own advisory board to guide and inspire you with in-the-moment mentorship from topic experts and professionals dedicated to providing exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. Together, we're going to build the greatest exchange of knowledge and expertise and service to entrepreneurs in business today. So click that link in the chat if you're interested to find or become a mentor today. Quick housekeeping item, we're going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event to address your individual questions. So please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Now, none of what we do here could be possible without all the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, BPM, and NZTE. We are humbled by their contributions. Now, something we've been doing since almost a year ago is during these unique times, we're curious on how sentiment is among the entrepreneurs that we work with. So we're going to start by taking a quick poll that I'm going to launch, letting us know how you're doing today. 2021, here we are. It's been a year since I've been stuck in my house working from home. So how are things going? Give us a second to let us know where you're at in the poll. Looks like we've got London on the call. Welcome, good evening, and Pittsburgh. So we've got some evening people, and it's probably pretty late for our good friend in London, so thanks for joining us. Appreciate those responses. They're still coming in, but I'm going to end this so we can get the show on the road. So I'm going to share these results. Optimism's at the top of the key, which is a good thing, but totally understand that surviving and fearful are things that you guys are feeling. The finance and sales being things that are keeping you up at night, totally understandable. Hopefully, we will get to some of those things, some tips and tricks from our special guest today during this talk. So without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guest, Talal Rafi. He's an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur. He's a consultant on corporate innovation and gender equality, and he is a World Bank Climate Ambassador. Talal, welcome.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Great.
Wonderful to be here.
We are happy to have you. So we're going to dive right in. Got a lot of great content to cover, so hopefully we'll get through it all. And again, if you guys have any questions, just drop them into the Q&A as we roll through this conversation. So Talal, serial entrepreneur, and you're working with the World Bank. You've had an amazing journey. Can you share a bit about what drew you to entrepreneurship in the first place and how you got started?
Starting off, what drew me to entrepreneurship was more of solving problems in society. So if you see my background, I've been advocating for climate change, in mitigating it through the World Bank as a climate change ambassador, or I was an expert at Chatham House on diversity and inclusion, especially focusing on gender equality, and at the same time working on poverty reduction. So in this field, when I became an entrepreneur, I was like, my main focus was I had to solve problems in society. That was my number one reason. And the second reason was regret. That's a very powerful emotion. Like Jeff Bezos says, when I'm 80, I don't want to sit back and say I could have done 100 different things in my life, but rather I would say that, I did try 100 different things and I failed. So always saying that, rather be a loser who tried a lot than a coward who did not try anything, to put it bluntly. And talking about my journey as an entrepreneur, how I came to where I am, my journey starts in London. So after completing my studies there, I was working in a very innovative electronic cigarettes firm. So from there, I was drawn into innovation, like how to market something that was completely new to the market. And after coming back to Sri Lanka, I was thinking, I want to be an entrepreneur because if you see my family history, my father was an entrepreneur, my grandfather, my great-grandfather come from a very entrepreneurial family. And I was able to go to a good school, go abroad to study. The reason was my previous generations did take risks. So I want my future generations to think the same way. So that's another very primary thing that's driving me towards entrepreneurship, to give a better life for my children. As you know, Sri Lanka being a third world country, you have to be really successful to be normal when compared to a developed country. So that was what really drove me in. And so after coming back to Sri Lanka, me and my partners, we were uh, going through a lot of ideas, and we started a few ventures. One was digital marketing, which was quite new back in the early 2010s, and later into organic foods as well, because again, digital marketing solving a problem in Sri Lanka, where a lot of companies were spending a lot of money on traditional marketing. So we want to solve that problem to give them more access in a cheaper way. And organic foods, because healthy eating is becoming something new, especially in this part of the world. And okay, so our most prominent thing was our co-working space. So that was one of Sri Lanka's first. And so while looking for office spaces in Sri Lanka for this, then we came across a lot of issues. Like to just get to know a good office space, you had to go for 1 month. You had to meet a lot of landlords, new places. It took us like 2 hours every day. And finally, even when you see an office space, you have to get a lawyer, the new agreements, and then after moving in, after signing the agreements, the furniture, the telephone connections, water, electricity, to get a cleaner, coffee, tea, internet. So much of issues. So as an entrepreneur, we knew that time is very much limited, and it's a very limited resource. And for a startup, a founder, taking away like 1 to 2 months of their time just to get a proper office was just too much. So we thought this was a serious problem. So if we could solve this issue, a lot of founders could use this valuable time to spend it on other things like marketing or looking for talent, building up their networks. So that's when we came up with the co-working space Hub Point, which is one of Sri Lanka's first, with ready-made office spaces where all you had to do, our concept is very simple. All you have to do is just walk in. Within half an hour, you're able to walk to a desk, sit down, start your work. And that's one way how we solve problems in Sri Lanka.
That's amazing. And Phil, yes, who's on a lot of these webinars, chimed in saying the regret minimization principle from Bezos. So he's calling out your starting entrepreneurship to not wanting to regret. I believe Edison said, "I didn't find one way that worked. I found 1,000 that didn't." Up next, this talks about expanding internationally, and many are founders out there in the ecosystem and on this live webinar are thinking about and hoping to expand internationally. So what's some of the brand value and potential of doing business in international markets?
So when it comes to brand value, there's a huge amount, especially like when you, for a startup in this part of the world, but even for a startup from the developed world. Like when you see, when you call yourself a global firm, it's like it adds a lot of value because people tend to see that the products you're selling is also liked by people in other countries. So your company is also registered in another country. So it's like it brings in more trust in the brand. And also the word global or calling yourself a multinational company adds a huge amount of brand value, amount of trust people are willing to put in. Like an example, I was talking to a consultant from McKinsey. I mean, arguably probably one of the most powerful brands in the world. And they tell me that there is a reason why they call themselves a global management consulting firm. So the word global adds a huge value, especially when it comes to brand. And yeah.
Amazing. So speaking of going global, before taking the leap, What should our entrepreneurs think about first and foremost?
So, first of all, before taking the leap, I always, even for our ventures, we always have to look at our core country, how we are performing, how is the market there, how are our competitors, are we able to move out, are we able to move out certain capabilities out of the country? Because if it's a saturated market, there has to be a reason for going global. For example, like if your market is saturated or the product there's nothing else to sell, or some other reason where you need to keep growing. So these are some of the things you have to kind of look in. And the other one, which I've also written an article on, is about moving the strategic assets. So if it's like too early, then you're in deep trouble. What I mean by strategic assets is the talent you have. For example, like when you're going abroad, and when you're like, for example, let's say you're neck to neck fighting with a competitor, this is not the time to like move your key players or your key employees out of the country. So there is a sort of a shift outside, and also financial resources or the marketing budget. So these are all things you need to consider. And finally, there has to be, the most important thing is what people don't consider much is when you're a founder and when you're moving to another country, there's also this thing about time, the amount of time we spend on the board. So we have a board of directors meeting, like let's say once every 2 weeks. So when you move to another country, there's also a shift away, time taken to discuss that. So my advice is that we need to be sort of fully secure, and moving abroad has to be for a reason. Like you're a bit safe, but you can't be like too safe. That means no company in the world would ever go global. So you have to be kind of like a bit stable on the home turf, and then you can look for expansion elsewhere.
That's amazing. Yeah. So speaking about some of the intricacies, so then I'm sure it's a lot. Why do you think entrepreneurs should expand globally then?
So there's a lot of reasons to expand globally. So when you look at, for example, the US market, just to give some figures, um, the US market was at its peak just after the Second World War. Like in 1945, half of the global GDP was in the US. And the rest of the world was just like Europe, though Britain, France, to an extent, won the Second World War. They were quite bankrupt. Their empires were collapsing. Russia was devastated. Japan was, had lost the war. China was in a civil war. And Asia, Africa were all uh, under the colonizers, the European colonizers. So that was a time when any US entrepreneur only had to look in. I mean, it wasn't worth going out. But today, it's quite a different world. I mean, you have the EU, the European market, which is equal to the US. So if you want to double your growth, you have to look across the continent. And also China. China is almost up to the US level. And it's also considered the largest consumer market. And then you have a rising India, which in a decade or two will be on par with the US, and Southeast Asia. Africa is coming up, Middle East coming up. So there is a lot of market outside to grow. And global managing director of McKinsey was saying, before the Industrial Revolution, the center of global economic power was somewhere in Asia. But after the Industrial Revolution, it's moved towards the Atlantic. But now it's slowly shifting back eastwards. So the primary reason would be revenue. But other reasons are to get talent. There's a lot of talent outside, and especially after the pandemic with more remote working, there is a lot of companies getting talent from outside. But when you base your company outside the country, in a new country, you're hiring people with diverse cultures, diverse experience. So this brings in a lot. And back to the company, and they could come up with new ideas that could change the company or give it a huge boost. And the last thing is diversifying risk, because when your company is only focused in the home country and there is an economic downturn, a war, or some other thing going on, then the company gets affected. But if it's like equally in another country, like let's say the company is based in US, covers Europe and China. So if something goes wrong in the US or probably EU or China, only 1/3 of the market of its revenues are affected. So these are some of the reasons why a company should go global, in my view.
It's great advice, Talal. And you talked a moment ago about how the importance of building brand helps validate in other markets with investors or customers or even employees. So, how do
Yeah.
you think, or how would you suggest that our small businesses and startups start building their business brand and reputation for global expansion?
Uh, so how we can do that is more about building up a good product. So that is the most basic thing. But I want to always emphasize that going global, it has to be something more than, there is a reason that's more important than having a good product. Because the minute somebody else in another country wants your product, it means that the product or service is not available in their country. So they anyway want to have your product. A a much more important reason when we look at expanding globally is think about validation, whether they can trust your company. So this is one field that one question that we always face. And because like unlike doing business locally where you can find information about the person, when doing it, partnering with or supplying to somebody in another part of the world, it's much more difficult. And if somebody breaks the agreement, it's more like a much bigger hassle, the time, the costs to take legal action when it's like somebody outside. So it's always about validation. So one way we could do is brand partnership. So that was one angle how we tackled it. For example, just before the pandemic for our co-working space HubPoint, we were approached by somebody in Maldives to move start a branch there, but unfortunately it couldn't happen because of the pandemic. But one of the reasons was that we partnered with Hilton Hotels. So that's a global brand. So because we didn't have conference facilities, so what we did was we outsourced our facilities to them. I mean, they benefited, we benefited. But one thing the Maldivian potential partner said was that the main reason was because we were partnered with a global brand. Thus, we were sort of validated. There was a trust in our brand. So that is one way to do that, partnering with more trusted brands. So same thing happened with like our other venture, like Venture Green. One thing we did was we faced an issue where we didn't have a huge marketing budget because we were just starting, and we needed to expand globally as well. So we brainstormed and came up with something. So what we did was we met a local politician who was, I mean, every other country, recognizes them in a way, though we don't all like them. So what we did was he launched our product, and buyers abroad, they were like, oh, a local minister of the government has done this. So they were willing to buy from us because he was the exports minister at that time. So these were a number of ways that we were able to capture global markets.
That's great. And also, I mean, so speaking of branding, the personal brand is something that I think many of our entrepreneurs are trying to build, but also struggle with building. So why is building your personal brand, especially with regards to expanding globally, important?
So building a personal brand, especially when it comes to doing business globally, is very important because once again, it's unless you're a huge company like McDonald's or probably Coke, you don't need personal connections to do it. I mean, you can just go to a country and there'll be a list of people standing to partner with you. But when you're a much smaller business, most of the things happen through personal connections. And for them to know about you, there has to be some sort of a brand, some sort of a recognition or association related with you. So that's at the core of it. And also, it's about how to build that connection. Because once again, like I said in my previous answer, it's back to how they can validate you, how they can trust you. So one way of doing that would be, for example, joining chambers, associations. That is one way, because the thing is, that's like even when I'm exporting and I'm finding buyers abroad, what I do is the basic level to back check them other than LinkedIn would be to see if they are part of any chambers or associations in another country. Because the thinking is that once they're part of a chamber or association, we feel that the chamber or the association would have done sort of a background check on them. So there is a bit of trustability coming in. And other than that, on how I build a personal brand, especially when doing business abroad, because I also do consulting. So on innovation and other areas. So what I do is I follow this thing about writing thought leadership articles or talking at events. And so one such thing was, I would say, the mentor makers thing of yours was very useful, because through that I was able to meet someone and get into an advisory board of a Silicon Valley startup as well. So thanks again to NASDAQ for that. And lastly, sort of building a personal brand, though, we shouldn't do this for financial gains. And I do it because of a lot of personal reasons to giving back to society. But it has helped me in a way by working in the development sector, like doing a lot of social work. I've been involved with a World Bank project or on entrepreneurship development and Asian development initiative on helping startups, or Chatham House with gender equality, and other organizations like USAID in creating a sort of a mentoring platform back in Sri Lanka. So, and doing talks, writing thought leadership articles, especially for Forbes. So these are some of the ways we can build our personal brand. And that comes very useful, especially when somebody abroad, they're always going to be looking at every information, and the more brands you're associated with, the more helpful it is for them.
That's super helpful. And we totally follow your pay it forward philosophy here. So I'm glad that you enjoyed Mentor Makers. Networking is something that we used to host in San Francisco, but now that we have a global ecosystem all on our Zoom platform here, what are some tips for networking in a global market, even during a pandemic?
So during a pandemic, as far as networking was concerned globally, I mean, probably 2020 was my most successful year, because before that, it was more about in-person meetings, physical, and based in Sri Lanka, I couldn't get much out of it because traveling is quite expensive. But with the pandemic, more people were connecting virtually. So I would still say that the number one way to connect would be LinkedIn. Even NASDAQ, I was able to connect through LinkedIn first. So that's a key thing. And my advice is always for people who want to network properly, keep your LinkedIn profiles updated and keep it in an orderly way, because when nowadays the first thing they look at is your LinkedIn profile, and that's some way that you can connect to a lot of people around the world, and they're willing to change things. And so the other way to network globally would be, or even locally, would be joining advisory boards committees. So that was one way that I personally grew my networks. So one advantage of that is, like, if you join, I mean, if you're not part of I'm not saying we should start off with a corporate board, but start off with a nonprofit board. So once you join in, you're going to be meeting other people who are similar. I mean, if a nonprofit is going to hire another person to their board, they're going to be quite prominent, connected people. And the advantage of being in a board or committee is that they meet like once a month or at least once in 2 months. And over time, you're meeting with them probably in person or through a Zoom call. And after 6 months, you form a very strong relationship with them, which can come in very usefully. So that is the second way of building your network. And the last thing is business networks. So these are another way of building your connections elsewhere, like going into global networks, like, for example, the Global Entrepreneurship Network. Like in Sri Lanka, I'm on the board of directors of the Global Entrepreneurship Network for Sri Lanka. So that is one way where I can connect with the people from other countries. They can be my future potential buyers. I can work with them. But at the same time, it's always good to share things with them and build your connection. They can lead you to some other person they know. So these are ways. Another thing would be the Forbes Business Council, which I'm part of. So these are a number of ways you can connect globally. And of course, the Mentor Makers movement as well.
That's awesome. Yeah. And considering your location, that's different advice than we have received for expanding networks. Many people are using the new platform Clubhouse to network these days, but and there's nothing bad to say about the platform, other than it's who knows where it will go.
Right.
I mentioned you live in Sri Lanka, so good early morning to you.
Thank you.
Can you mention can you discuss a little bit about some of the business culture in Asia, in Silicon Valley? This is dressing up, and so, but I definitely wouldn't wear that to a meeting in Asia. So can you talk about some of the advice for our US-based entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so the cultures differ a lot, especially like you said, probably dressing up more formal works in Asia. So talking about different cultures, one thing that in my experience in Asia is most of the business is done based on trust and sort of like personal friendships, because it's due to the way our culture is developed. Like, for example, just to give an example about my country, Sri Lanka. So when it comes to enforcing legal contracts, we rank 162nd in the world. So, for example, if somebody breaches an agreement, it takes about 4 years to go to courts, settle it, and it's a huge process. So, I mean, it's very similar in the rest of the region. So unlike in the US, like with an agreement, if somebody does this thing, you take them to court, sue them. It doesn't work in that way, and only large companies do that. So this has led to a culture doing business more based on trust. But I'm not saying it's all bad, because since everybody does this based on trust and personal connections, people are less likely to break contracts because they lose their name in society. So this is one basic thing about the difference of culture here. And other than that, just talking about different cultures, for example, when we do business, like, for example, with the Japanese, one thing is noted is that it takes quite some time to develop the relationship. It's not like immediate, but the benefits are very much, because once you develop a relationship, it's usually lifelong. And consulting with my friends in the gem industry, one thing about doing business with the Japanese is that once they come to your country or you go there, it's like you have to take care of everything, from bringing them from the airport to the hotel, to paying for the hotel, taking them home for lunch, dinner. So these are some of the things how we deal with the Japanese people. Other than that, for example, Maldives, the culture is quite different, because people have money. It's a bit more casual, but also the market is small. And one issue would be, for example, since it's small and it's a democracy, it's like most of the people are either on one side of the political side, either with the opposition or the government. And of course, if you partner with somebody from the government, it's very easy, things get done. But the problem is that in 5 years, the people in the government come to the opposition, and it's the other way. And then, and then it's like not so easy any longer. Or like doing business in Myanmar, it's still based on friendship. But one thing is that most of the laws are in the local language, and some, they say, the laws sometimes are updated in a very informal way, especially on Facebook pages, according to a friend of mine who did business there. So, talking about India, where my country, Sri Lanka, shares the most values with, culture with, it's more like one thing about doing business with Indians, or even with us, is that it's very interesting that if you ask us something, it's very tough for us to say no to the face. So we always, when you say, oh, I'll let you know, or I'll think about it, it's like such a tough thing. So it's an indirect way of saying no. So that's one thing. And it's also based on hierarchy. So the higher you are, the respect has to be shown to the person who is high in command or high in age. So these are some of the things, like whether it's doing business with the Chinese or Indians, like receiving a card with 2 hands. And lastly, talking about, like, when you talk about doing business with Asia, you can't leave the Chinese out. They're the largest economy. And with them, I was personally partners with them a few years ago. One thing we noticed that it's always, they tend to, the relationships take some time, especially after a few meetings. Usually come home, you host them here, you go to their home, and they cook for you. And exchange a lot of gifts. So these are some of the different cultures and how to do business there, in my knowledge.
That's super helpful and interesting, Talal. We had a question, speaking of China, and speaking of China, so Jane looks like she's running a new cool auto bike tour startup, and she's looking to enter the Chinese market. That's right in line with what my next question for you in our run of show is how can one understand if their product will even sell in a new market?
When you're moving into a new market, the first question I always ask is how big is the market? For example, like for a US-based company, the size of the market is important. For example, it could be a developed world. The people could have the power. But if you're moving into a country like Singapore or Hong Kong, it's like the market is the people have money, but it's still a much smaller market. So you need to do really well and you need to have a look at the competition. But if you're going into a much larger market like the EU, India, or China, for that matter, so then like even if you get 5 to 10% of the market, that's quite enough to make it extremely profitable because the market is huge. And also how developed is the country? That's another key thing. Like for example, India, though the market is 1.2 billion, but if you really go in, like only 100 million, only like around 10% of the population is like middle class or upper middle class. So most of the products would be targeted towards them. So though the entire population comes out as big in the developing world, the actual buying power is with a very small amount of people. So that's one thing. The other thing is competition. How big is the competition? We always have to look at things like not just how big is the competition or how well they're doing, but also when you're doing business in Asia and other parts of the world, it's also about how influential they are. Like, for example, we saw how Amazon is trying to go into India, and they're met with a local company, Geo, which is huge, which is owned by the richest man in Asia. But what we find is, though Amazon is a very powerful, large company, the local company also is well connected in that country. So it's always a clash over there. So competition is something you need to really assess, not just in terms of their financial power, but how well they know the local market, how well they can fight it out there. Like one example would be how McDonald's couldn't get much in the Philippines because their rival Jollibee, two factors they say contributed. One was that people there preferred something much sweeter and they wanted a smell with the food. So these are certain things that you need to know the culture about, and the competitors, especially if they're local, they know how to handle this. And the other thing is the product life cycle, whether it's a saturated market or at the growth stage, and also the target market, whether it's if it's something for the upper class, like for example, something that is affordable only to the upper class in the developing world could be affordable to basically everyone in the developed world. So there's a number of factors which we need to take into consideration.
Nice. And building off that, just want a little bit more. So you've done your market analysis. What are there some ways to, other than bringing a large shipping container full of product, are there some ways to test and validate your market before actually entering it?
Other than that, to validate the market, a few things which we could do is like always, if there is no way of me finding out anything about the partner in another country, as a last resort, I always call our embassy in that country. So that is one way of checking it out. And there are probably people working there. They know the local people, and they will connect me to them, and then they can do a proper background check. So that's like a sort of a last resort advice I would give startups. Like if you're unable to find any validation about the company, and if they're not part of any chambers or anything, always your country embassy in that country would be a way to find out.
That's some great advice. I have never thought of doing that. So going back to the relationship side, because I know it's much more important in Asia and in other cultures. So how do you suggest building deep relationships? Even in the US, I think relationships are very important. So how do you suggest building deep relationships when cultures are different?
So, like I said previously, it's always good to understand the culture best. So, me, because I studied in a very multicultural university and I lived in London, which is uh, considered the most multicultural city in the world. I had the opportunity of making friends in almost every country in the world. So, by being part of many organizations like Forbes Business Council and Global Entrepreneurship Network, I had the ability of having friends like from Venezuela to Philippines to Turkey. So these are ways that you can have connections there. And it's always good to, before having a meeting with your potential partners, it's always good to give a call to your friend there or people you know there and understand the culture and how we can become friends. And most importantly, more than what you do, I mean, even if you do something that's, don't do something that should be done, I'm sure the other counterparts would be very forgiving. But it's always good to know what you shouldn't do, like certain things. Like, for example, when I was partnering with my Chinese friends, one thing was they're a little bit superstitious. And for them, I'm not talking about all the Chinese, but the number 4 was a bit, they were a bit superstitious about that number. So these are the small things that you need to consider. And like I said, if you don't have anything, as always, what I do is like I contact the local embassy there. Like even while working for a World Bank project, when we needed to connect with somebody in Singapore, and I couldn't find any immediate contact, what I did was I contacted our embassy there, and they were very helpful in connecting me to the local university. So that's one way to build it. And after understanding it, it's good to go in their way and build a much deeper this thing. As far as like our part of the world is concerned, like Sri Lanka and being very similar to India, like Sri Lanka and India, somewhat like the US and Canada, though different in many ways, also similar in a lot of ways. So in here, it's more like you want to build a relationship. It's sometimes quite personal. So mostly we invite people to our homes, dinner, and we don't talk about business there. So it's like the families meet, the children meet, and that's how we develop a much stronger bond. So that's one way to develop a much this thing. Speaking about my region and my culture.
Amazing. And if you're ever out in stateside, I'll definitely invite you to my house for dinner.
Sure.
I'm a decent chef, but nobody pays me to do it
Love to come.
anymore.
Thanks, Amit.
So we had a question come in that I thought would just be interesting as we continue to roll along this discussion. And 5 folks out there in attendee land, we're going to try to get to Q&A. So please let us know if you have any questions. But Martina asked, can you summarize quickly which countries you've had experience expanding to? Just to give a little.
When it comes to expanding, we had this thing with, for example, Dubai, we were doing business with, and a little bit with Hong Kong and Maldives. So these were one countries, and at the same time with the UK as well. So this was mostly like a venture we were doing something else at the very beginning about sending off shipments of coconut oil, drinking coconut oil. So that was one business that we were doing it. So it was like king coconut in a bottle. That was something new. As a counterpart to like, because now the whole world is moving towards healthy drinks. So we thought that that would work. And that was one thing. And when it comes to our organic foods, mostly with European markets at the moment. And with our co-working space, though we are in the negotiating stage and not moving yet, it's the Maldives.
Great, thanks for sharing. So go-to-market strategies are something that a lot of our founders deal with. So how do you build an effective, successful go-to-market strategy with an emphasis on flexibility when going internationally?
So building a go-to-marketing strategy, one of the first things I do is always go have a customer journey. Think from the point of view of the customer. Then you know like what they want in that country, do the background check. Like a good example I could give is how KFC won over the Chinese market. Some of the things they did was from the beginning, they understood the market. They catered to the local tastes. Like they had congee, they had local food and soybean drinks. And also with K-Pro, they were able to give fruit drinks and tuna salads for the millennials. And it was marketed as something for the grown-ups, or pretty much like everyone. When compared to McDonald's, which is not as successful in China, the main reason was they just kept their menu. They did not change it to the local tastes. So they were viewed as more Western. The food was viewed as Western. But also a simple understanding, a simple research McDonald's could have done was that what was very interesting is that McDonald's portrays itself as a family restaurant. But one thing to be noted in China is that they had a one-child policy. So there were much less children there. And with only one child in the family, when the child quickly grows up, I mean, it doesn't see a need to go to a family restaurant that much. So that was one of the main reasons how McDonald's failed. And if they had done a customer journey from the point of view of a customer, they would have been more successful. So this is one thing that I always consider when moving into a market. And also about how people are influenced, how they buy, and who their influencers are. Like, for example, one country is like, if you take millennials, it could be Instagram influencers, like an older generation celebrity, and also like how they get influenced from, like the millennials through social media. The older generation still reads the papers, watches TV in this part of the world. So these are factors we need to consider when you consider a go-to marketing strategy. Also, the target market, like who you're targeting with, do they have the capability or capacity to buy what you're offering? So these are factors we need to consider, especially when you're considering a go-to marketing strategy from another part of the world. Like how, for example, like, can you enter the market at what strength will you be when you're entering the market? For example, when Walmart was making a decision, they were either to go into Europe and fight in a saturated market. I mean, the market was big, but it was like there was no growth and all the customers were already buying from other supermarkets. But when you go to Brazil, it was like a growing market. So they could win the market here. So Europe could take time to go in, but the further they delayed going into South America, the more market share they kept losing to new players. So these are like tough decisions when you have to consider when you're looking for a go-to marketing strategy.
Awesome, Talal. And speaking of considerations, regulations and laws in international markets differ. So any advice, any resources there for them to potentially dodge some headaches in the future?
So, I mean, on that question, I struggle a bit because different countries have different rules. Like speaking to my friend consulting for other countries, like for example, when you look at Myanmar, we find that the rules are mostly in their local language, and sometimes, as they say, updated on Facebook pages. Or like if you see Sri Lanka, it's more like a bit difficult because we rank a bit low on ease of doing business, 99th in the world. So my best advice is always, if you're moving into a new market, to find a local partner. So that's the best way to get around everything, especially if it's a large business. They're probably connected locally and they can get things done. Because in this part of the world, one thing is that there's a lot of bureaucracy to do with. So a lot of stages in the government to go through. You know, for one document to go in, it has to go through several officers. And so having the networking skills, if you're friendly with the officials or this thing, the process can be moved much faster. And regarding regulations, as this thing, as a last option, it's always good to hire a lawyer, though it can be costly.
I hear that one. Well, it's time in our schedule to switch to Q&A. So if you haven't already, drop your questions into the Q&A box. If we have time, Talal, I'll jump to some of these other ones, but I've got a question from a supporter of me and the Milestone Makers program, Peter Kovacs. Shout out to you for supporting many of our founders throughout the programs. But his question is, what is your biggest challenge? What has been your biggest challenge coming from cultural differences, and how did you handle it?
Uh, Biggest challenge when it comes to cultural these things is that one big challenge is though I said that we can find a local person there or a friend, it's still a bit challenging when you're dealing with somebody from a different culture. So it takes time to change, time to adapt. So that was one challenge, especially like also adapting to the changes. Like when you're making strategic decisions, you still have a lot to consider. Like you grew up in one culture, so you're used to thinking in that way, and you're used to thinking that the consumers will also think like you. So after being programmed like that for decades, it's very difficult to move to a new culture and uh, again tune your brain to thinking in a way a different culture would think. So that is basically my biggest challenge, I would say.
Super helpful. We get another question, and feel free to dodge this one because I know you're not a lawyer, but you have them. How useful is it to file patents in other countries to protect their businesses?
Uh, like I said, a disclaimer would be I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give a really good answer. But with my limited knowledge, it's like a patent. It's quite useful. But one thing I found is that the challenges are different when it comes to different countries, because you can prove that you own the patent or the copyright or the brand logo, but in different countries, like I said, in Sri Lanka, the process is much longer. So somebody, like if you go to another part of the country, you still have to go through their legal procedures, which can take much longer. So we always have a battle with the US accusing China of infringement. But so these are some of the things. So it's also, I mean, it's extremely useful, but it depends on the country and how long the process will be if somebody breaks it.
Yeah, because 4 years is a long time to have to be battling with somebody over a patent. Let's see. Well, you brought up mentor makers earlier. So mentorship is at part of the core philosophy here at the center. Can you share a little bit about a mentor who supported you?
Yeah, I can share because I would say that I would very strongly advise people to have mentors, because in my when it comes to my life, a mentor did change my life. So we had a mentor who was a prominent figure in Sri Lanka, and one of the advices he gave me was before about 3 years ago, when I was a much smaller person, very much less prominent. So what he told me was, as your mentor, my target is you should be on the corporate board of a listed company. So that was quite like, that was very tough. And, but what it led to was in the next 3 years, I did build my brand. So he advised me on two things: to build my personal brand, and also to network as much as possible. So in the 3 years, because of that advice, one thing was that gave me a lot of confidence. So I was like, here is an established person who's been the chairman of so many big companies. He thinks that I'm capable of being on a corporate board. So that's like, wow. So I've been like, I need to be more confident about myself back then. So with that, I was able to like grow my personal brand. I was doing a lot of thought leadership articles, writing for Forbes, other local, like the local Sri Lankan Financial Times, and at the same time giving a lot of talks. So this was helping me build my personal brand. And also I started joining a lot of advisory boards, committees, which are all contributing to building my personal brand and my profile in the aim of getting on a corporate board of a listed company. So these all helped me. This was one thing. And the other thing was networking as well. Networking. So this led me to like meet up with a lot of the top people, speaking with them, building my connections. And at the same time, I was also able to go more into the development sector. Though I had a passion for it, like working with the World Bank Ahead project, or the Asian Development Bank's Digital Against COVID-19 Innovation Series, where I was a member of the Global Selection Committee, or being an expert at Chatham House on formulating recommendations for the G7, G20 on gender equality post-COVID. So these were a number of things that I took as a result of my mentor wanting me to be on the board of a listed company. So it was just the encouragement, the confidence given. So this is a huge thing, especially an advice that I would give people is to have a mentor. Because another reason is that as we are young, I'm also in my 30s, we tend to make a lot of emotional decisions. Like when things go really well, we jump on to a new deal without doing any background check. So this is normal for young people like us. And at the same time, when things go bad, things are really bad, we get a bit depressed and decide to give up and close our business down. So the advantage of having a mentor is that these are people who are much calmer, have more emotional intelligence than us. And most of them like over 60, when you consider them, when you have a mentor who is over 60 years old, his life experience, his business experience is our age. So that's an immense amount of value they bring in, and the amount of emotional intelligence. I mean, they could say that, hey, wait a minute, don't give up. I've been in this situation. It's just very simple. Do this, 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 and you get done. Or just like, I'm there to look after things. Just continue for some time. I'll keep a lookout for you. So these are ways which mentors can help. And as somebody who was part of a project developing a mentoring platform locally, I would say that it's one of the most useful ways, because according to a study, we find that even after 5 years for an established startup, the failure rate is 50%, but with successful mentoring, it comes down to 30%. So even an established firm, your failure rate can be reduced by 40% with successful mentoring.
Sound advice. So you mentioned the power of deep relationships with mentors and encouraging people to have them. Many don't have large networks, and you did give us some advice on how to network globally, especially during the pandemic, which has been a challenge. We've all been in the conference room or in a conference hall with hundreds of people, right? They're all walking around. And now it's a digital conference room. Are there some tips you have for the first 5 minutes or for just meeting new people that you have for our entrepreneurs to help cultivate a relationship beyond just a business card?
So one thing is, one way in my experience to go beyond just networking and giving a business card is that one strategy I used was diversifying my profile. For example, I'm involved with on the corporate side with innovation, being on the board of a startup which is in machine learning in the financial sector in Silicon Valley, to a startup in the Philippines which is involved in agri-tech in the Philippines, or doing a business in co-working space, or organic foods, digital marketing. So diversifying my corporate presence there and writing about corporate strategy, innovation, and being in the development sector with a number of projects, entrepreneurship development, diversity and inclusion, focusing on gender equality or climate change. So one advantage is that when I meet somebody and when I talk to them, I have a huge, a lot of different things which increases the possibility of having something in common with people. So that is one advantage that has led me. So I can speak to pretty much like somebody and they will have something in common with what I do. So there is always something to go beyond that. So this is something that I always tell young people and anyone, always like the advice a lot of people give to corporate companies, like diversify, reduce risk, always diversify your profile, diversify your career, like get involved in a lot of different sectors, so that at the end of the day, like with disruption coming in and the World Economic Forum predicting that a number of jobs are going to be lost, especially due to automation, there's always the need to diversify and also find new things which the machines cannot take over. So diversifying into different fields would be very useful in that, especially in terms of building new connections and going beyond the business card.
Super helpful advice. Well, we won't have time to get to all the questions and we're almost at time, and I wanted to get to one of these. And yes, Cirrus, the replay will be posted and distributed after this. But one question, and before I leave our audience with your number one piece of advice, is there anything that you wish you had known when you had started besides the things that you have already mentioned?
So known I would say the ability to network much better. That is one thing. But other than that, had I known something, there's one important thing that I would like to share, which could be very useful for people listening, is that this was said by the global managing director of McKinsey after he spoke to the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And one thing, the same question was posed to them. And what they said was, what do you wish you had done when you were younger? Which you, if you're brought back, you could. And the number one thing among all, the most common thing said was among Fortune 500 company CEOs was that they wish they had been more ambitious when they were younger. So that's the advice I would say. And though I'm still in my 30s, I wish like if I was able to go 10 years back, I would be even more ambitious.
Sound advice. Well, Talal, really appreciate you giving time. What's the one golden nugget of advice that you have for our founders who are thinking about expanding globally, whether that's in Asia or anywhere else? What's the one sound piece of advice?
One thing is, the one good advice is, I would say, start networking very well. So that is the thing I can say from my point of view. Get involved in a lot of international organizations, update your LinkedIn profile. So these will be very useful when you make connections abroad, because when you're looking at something like, for example, you want to export your technology or partner with somebody else, it's like you've made your business in your core thing, and you don't, when you're expanding to another country, you're partnering with someone, you don't have to get involved in the operations much, especially when you're exporting something. All you have to do is take your products to the shipping center, and once that leaves, you get your cash. So it can be something that's less of a hassle, but brings you a lot of money. And most of the problem related to distributing it, marketing it, is with the other person who is buying your product. So building a network could mean like, and finding a product which they need can be a very quick way of making money and becoming more successful. So that's one way, just network and get involved in exporting, because that's one business where there's a lot of financial gain, but at the same time, the risk and the amount of work is much less.
Great. And have ambition, right?
Talal,
Rafi, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. To everyone on the call, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you guys all online soon. We've got some great webinars coming up on March 24th, tomorrow. We've got How to Build Your Own Advisory Board with Hello Alice's CEO, Carolyn Rods. And on Thursday, we've got Facebook Marketing with Michelle from Facebook. So hope you could join us. Talal, thank you again so much. And we look forward to seeing you all online soon. Thanks again, everybody.